You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 10th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Israel's Prime Minister is headed to Washington to toughen up Donald Trump on Iran while avoiding pushback on Israeli settlements in the West Bank. We'll hear from our Middle East correspondent Layla Milana Allen. After that,
you want to put bad guys away?
Ow! Stop pulling my ears, stop pulling my ears. Never pull a bunny's ears.
Be on the same page every day.
Never pull a bunny's ears. That is a clip from Zootopia 2. We'll hear from the producer and director of the biggest animation film of all time, and from our own Fernando Augusto Pacheco, and then to Monocle in Milan.
It was very important that Triennale and the Chamber of Commerce offered this as a cultural entertainment during the Olympics.
Our team in Milan spoke to the curators of an exhibition dedicated to the future of winter sports well beyond these Olympics. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Very happy Tuesday. Good to have you all with us. We'll start in the Middle East today, where Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is preparing for a meeting with US President Donald Trump at another delicate time for the region. The US is negotiating over Iran's nuclear program, among other things, potentially, while Israel is busy changing its own laws to expand further into the West Bank. Just how much Netanyahu and Trump see eye to eye on all of this is one question. Whether the Trump administration will actually intervene to clip Netanyahu's wings or the other way round is quite another. Well, joining us now is Monocle's Middle East correspondent Layla Milana Allen. Layla, great to have you back on the show. There's some deja vu I'm sensing to a lot of this that we're going to be talking about. So let's try and get through it. But particularly on Iran, I mean, Netanyahu aggressively sought to stop a former U.S. President, Barack Obama, from making a deal on Iran's nuclear program, and now he's back trying to do the same thing with Trump.
Absolutely right. And I think, certainly one thing that Ben Netanyahu knows, let's be clear that, the Trump administration has not always been on Netanyahu's side about everything, but he does see a much more Iran skeptic president here than the past two Democrat presidents. And he knows that this has been his, drum to beat for over the last decade. He has always been convinced that Iran is not being honest about its uranium supplies, that it's not being honest about the amount that it's enriching those supplies or its intentions with them. And of course, he scored an enormous victory last year when he convinced America to, during that 12-day war, hit those three nuclear facilities, which is something, that previously U.S. administrations had always backed off from actually striking Iran. So clearly he believes enough was not done, and that this is an opportunity rather than allowing a deal to be made again, since, of course, the Trump administration in his last term pulled out of that nuclear deal that had been made in 2015, rather than allowing a new deal to happen, to actually put even further pressure on Iran after those strikes last year.
Well, but at the same time, Layla, I'm imagining this is what concerns Netanyahu, that Trump is, famously quite fickle. Yes, he is certainly more aggressive on Iran than Barack Obama or Joe Biden will have been. He has launched strikes on Iran before, but he's also the guy who makes a deal either because he believes a deal is now possible or because he's simply tired of dealing with Iran. What is Netanyahu going to try to say to convince him that that's not the best course of action?
That's absolutely right. And look, that foreign policy wise, this year with Trump has really been a wild ride. On the one hand, you have, the kind of constant insistence that they don't want US troops involved anywhere, that they really want to back off and kind of let countries deal with themselves, possibly pulling US troops out of Syria right now, who are a very small stabilizing force, just so they don't have troops in the Middle East. On the other hand, we have 3 warships and a full US aircraft carrier group, which is thousands of troops, that a couple of weeks ago were sent into the Arabian Sea. So, it's always very unclear what exactly he's going to do. It seems clear that he's really willing to take any of the options on the table, and it's often quite predictable what he'll decide. Now, just to give listeners a little bit of context about what's happening right now, this all started because, of course, since the end of December, we've been seeing these huge protests in Iran and an unprecedented backlash from the Iranian regime. At least thousands of protesters killed, probably tens of thousands. And the reason that those numbers are so crazily all over the place is because there's been an absolute shutdown on the internet by the regime in Iran, which means that really it's incredibly difficult. While individual stories of horror and videos of horror are getting out, it's really difficult to get any kind of sense of exactly what these numbers are. But we know it's a completely unprecedented, brutal crackdown, in the thousands rather than hundreds that we've seen in previous protests over the last 2 decades, of people killed, of people imprisoned. Now, initially, Trump was saying that he wanted to sort of target the regime for that, to stop them from killing protesters. He says that they negotiated and he managed to stop them hanging nearly 1,000 arrested protesters. The Iranian foreign minister says that's completely untrue. So initially, this was sort of about potentially regime change, or at least some sort of regime pressure. It now seems to have changed completely to being very focusedly just about nuclear talks. And here's what's key. There are 3 pillars for those people who sort of see Iran as this center of this axis of evil, axis of terrorism. Yes, there's the nuclear issue, but there are also 2 other issues: the militias that Iran funds and their ballistic missile capability. Now, nuclear has always been the big one that everyone talks about. The militias have been severely weakened over the last few years, both Hezbollah in Lebanon, of course, with that war at the end of 2024 with Israel, and then also Hamas, which Iran was funding too. Now, of course, the militias in Iraq are still well funded. We've still got the Houthis in Yemen. We've got a few other groups as well. And then there's this third factor. It was not clear until the 12-day war last year just how enormous Iran's ballistic missile capability is. And it became really clear during that war just how much they'd stockpiled and how powerful those missiles were. That's what's really worrying Netanyahu. So he's concerned about 2 things. Firstly, that he thinks that this nuclear deal will not go far enough. He's worried that there might be a sort of deal on a temporary cessation of uranium enrichment, which could work in Iran's favor, because we don't actually know how bad the damage from the US strikes on those 3 nuclear facilities in Iran last year was. It's possible that they can't enrich uranium right now. And so they could make Trump look good by saying, okay, we'll stop enriching for a few years and actually rebuild their capability in that time. And secondly, he wants a real focus on these ballistic missiles, on limiting that capability, on limiting those things being able to come into the country, being produced in the country, as do regional partners, because they are very worried that that's actually the thing. Those missiles are the thing that could spark more regional conflict.
Layla, let's turn to the West Bank, if we could, as well, before we let you go, because this might also be a topic of the talks between Netanyahu and Trump after the war in Gaza and the recognition of a Palestinian state by some European countries. We're now seeing Israel essentially turn its attention to the West Bank and potentially even sort of annex parts of the West Bank. What kind of pushback might Netanyahu get from the Trump administration on that?
The concern is, among many people in the region, almost nothing. The Trump administration has taken a strong stance on Gaza. Some would argue a stronger stance than the Biden administration. And they have managed to push through small amounts of change. Of course, most importantly, this questionable ceasefire, during which Israel has still been bombing Gaza quite heavily, but not to the extent it was before. However, there has been absolutely no focus on the West Bank. And in the time since October 7th, the situation in the West Bank has become incredibly drastic. A major UN figure, Volker Turk, just came out and said that he now sees very, very clear apartheid conditions in the West Bank. That's something the UN's always been too afraid to say before. I spent a lot of time in the West Bank at the end of last year, and the situation is unprecedented. It's really, really becoming a police state. All these gates that officials there used to essentially cut Palestinians off from different towns and villages. Those have doubled. There are now 1,000 of those. They have bulldozed Palestinian roads. They have bulldozed 3 of the camps in the north and ejected 40,000 people living in those camps who now have nowhere to live. And now what they're doing in the midst of this horrendous settler violence, often state-sponsored. Many people say that IDF soldiers actually go alongside and either protect these settlers or sometimes are complicit in the attacks. Alongside that, we've seen the declaration of 19 new settlements already this year in the West Bank. And now what the government is doing, there's of course this very right-wing coalition, leading members of which are very pro-increased illegal settlements in the West Bank, is that they are essentially removing a lot of the laws that have been made to try and prevent Israelis, Jewish citizens of Israel, from buying land illegally up in the West Bank. They're removing a lot of those strictures. They're removing also the checks and balances, things like having to put it through the courts, things like having to check that this is Israeli-owned land, that it's in the right part of the West Bank for an Israeli to be able to own it. They're essentially getting rid of all of those, and they're also looking at building a very major settlement which will essentially separate East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. Importantly, of course, East Jerusalem being the gateway for Palestinians to move in and out of the part of Jerusalem they're allowed to be in. So this really does look now like the combination of sort of police state measures, increased apartheid in terms of the amount of military checkpoint security that Palestinians have to go through to be allowed to move anywhere, incredible limits on their movement, and also huge support from the government to lead to even more of a loss of their land. And of course, the problem with that is that any hope of a two-state solution is based around this land in the West Bank that is supposed to be reserved for a future Palestinian state. The slow erosion of that by Israelis buying it up, building settlement, means that practically that becomes more and more of an impossibility in the future. And really, no one's paying attention to it. It's pretty unlikely it will come up in these talks because it's happening in the background and no one is focused on it.
Leila Milana Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent, thank you very much for unpacking some of what's been happening in the Middle East. And now here's Hassan Anderson with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. US Vice President J.D. Vance will head to Azerbaijan after finalising a trade corridor between the nation and Armenia. Vance arrived in Armenia's capital, Yerevan, on Monday for talks further consolidating a peace process between the two sides. The pair signed a historic deal last summer following decades of conflict. A Ukrainian Olympian has been told by the International Olympic Committee he is no longer allowed to wear a helmet depicting fallen athletes at the Milan Cortina Games. Vladislav Hereskevich, Kiev's representative in the skeleton, will be allowed to wear a black armband, with the IOC calling the move a compromise. Monocle has teams on the ground in Milan and Cortina d'Ampezzo, so follow our coverage on Monocle Radio throughout the next 2 weeks. And finally, the Seoul city government has announced it will officially sponsor K-pop supergroup BTS's comeback concert. According to officials, the gig is of public interest and will contribute to the city's administration, tourism and economy, making it eligible for funding. The concert will be held in South Korea's capital in March. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Hassan. Now, we are in the age of animation when it comes to movies, as evidenced by the enormous success of Zootopia 2. We'll be hearing from the producer and director of the film in a moment, but first, let's bring in our senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Fernando, right here in the studio. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chris.
Animation, it's been around for a long time. I mean, I'm sure we all have childhood memories. I certainly have childhood memories of Disney films. But it seems even bigger now. Is that possible?
Even bigger. Look at the top films of 2025. So the top 2, they are animations. The biggest one is the Chinese one, Neza 2, which is, wow, the biggest animation ever. And in second place was Zootopia, or Zootropolis, depending on the country you are, Zootopia 2, and that's the biggest Hollywood animation ever. So we're looking about record-breaking numbers. You know what, Chris? There's a lot of interest in animation. There are different types. As you can see in China, they have their own specific type of animation, the classic Disney films, and also anime from Japan. Because on the top 10 last year, we also had the latest Demon Slayer. So I think there's animation for all tastes, in a way.
Animation for all tastes, but also just from the way you describe that, is there something about animation that crosses borders, makes it more international than maybe some other types of films where we are seeing a bit of a fracturing of the global market?
You are so correct. For example, with Zootropolis 2, you're going to listen to my interview in a bit, because I was asking, it was a massive success in China. And that's a bit unusual today, because in the last, let's say, 2 or 3 years, Hollywood is kind of having some difficulties to crack that market. But honestly, and the producer was telling me, Yvette Marino, there was so much affection for the film from 10 years ago that the Chinese are obsessed with the film. You know, even in Disney Shanghai, I think there's kind of a ride based on Zootopia and many other things. And even the story, you're talking about a story that would mean something for someone in the US, in China. It's about that lovely rabbit moving from a small town to a big town. Everybody can relate to that, right?
And not grabbing a rabbit's ears. Obviously, we can all relate to that as well,
Exactly.
Faye. Just finally, I mean, Disney, are they still, I mean, obviously you mentioned China and they actually having the top spot, but Disney, are they still basically the undisputed leader of animation at this point? Who else is coming up and challenging them? You did mention Demon Slayer.
Yeah, but they are, you know, and not just animation. They are, you know, they were the biggest studio last year. And again, looking at the numbers, because in the top 5, you had Zootopia 2, you have Lilo and Stitch, the live action film. It's a bit complicated. It's live action, but it feels like an animation sometimes. And the latest Avatar as well. So Disney is still very, very strong. And I think, you know, the new CEO will have many challenges, of course. But let's be honest, I mean, he's got a lot to work on with.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, thank you. Let's hear now from the team behind the Oscar and BAFTA-nominated film Zootropolis 2 or Zootopia 2, Hollywood's biggest ever animation. We'll hear from the producer Yvette Marino and Jared Bush, director and chief creative officer of Walt Disney Animation Studios.
Come on, get on up.
Let me ask you something. Do you think we're a good team?
Of course. I just wish I knew what we had to do to prove it to everyone else.
Big pleasure talking to you both.
Yeah, likewise.
Perhaps, Jared, I'll start with you. I'm a massive fan of Zootropolis, the first one. What I find interesting, there's been a 10-year gap.
Yeah.
And the amazing success. I mean, were you surprised in any way or form about this incredible success worldwide, right?
Yes. I mean, I think you'd have to be. The turnout for this film has been honestly mind-blowing for us. And it's really rewarding. 700 people worked really, really hard on this movie. And they really poured their hearts and souls into it. I think at every step, everyone wanted to meet the bar of the first film, if not exceed it. And when I see the number of people that have gone to see this movie in theaters, people that have gone back to see it again in theaters because there's so much to take in, it's like a dream come true for us.
And Yvette, it's interesting that, of course, Hollywood is changing and audiences in different countries are changing. And I'm thinking here of China, for example. It's been some interesting years. Hollywood, you know, it's not necessarily that it's going to be a big hit in China, but that didn't happen as Zootropolis. So why do you think is that? Because I don't think, you know, some stories perhaps are not translating, but that's definitely not the case with Zootropolis too.
Yeah, I think with the original film Zootropolis, it really kind of resonated with many people over the world, but especially in China. There was something about the story of Judy leaving a small town and going to a big city and pursuing her dreams that resonated in China. I know it resonated with me, and I love Judy, you know, because of her story from the first film. And so continuing it in the second film, it really is kind of a continuation of the story of Judy and Nick. And, you know, we had the opportunity to go to Shanghai for the premiere there. And the love for these characters is like nothing I have seen before. And so it was so exciting to see how much people connected with these characters. And then to have them receive this film, like a continuation of the story of Judy and Nick in such a way has been truly, you know, mind-blowing.
And Jared, I was mentioning that my favorite character is the sloth, actually, because he made me laugh. There's a very special cameo. I'm not going to review anything here. But we're dealing here with so many characters, actually. I was reading 178, right? So it must be quite a challenging film technically to make as well, right?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I think this world is one where it needs to feel dense to feel like a real lived-in city. And I'd give enormous kudos to our character team, our riggers, our animators for making this place feel so lived in. Yeah, we have, I think, 150 something different species. We have 71 speaking roles, right? Which is, I think it's close to a record for us. And the thing in this world is you want all those to separate. But the fun thing with animals is that you can do that. You can play with the scale. You can have Mr. Big down there. You can have, something like, our new Mayor Wind Dancer who's so ridiculous. Patrick Warburton actually crushed him. And then we have Ke Huy Quan, who came in as Gary the Snake. And we needed that character to feel so vulnerable and so hopeful. We always say that he's even more Judy Hopps than Judy Hopps is. And so on the writing side, it's one of the most fun things in the world because you have this really wide palette, and it's really a question of like, when do you bring that character in? And luckily we pressure test this a lot and get some feedback on how much of a character is just right.
And you mentioned Garrett the Snake, that character. I think even the visuals for a snake, it's quite hard to do as well, right? To look kind of realistic, and how is it going to move on screen as well?
Well, yeah, and also it's a pit viper, and pit vipers have a very specific way of moving around. Also, their scales are very unique. You'll see this in the movie. There's something called keeled scales. They almost look like little feathers. That's unique to pit vipers. So we actually had to design software called Scoot, S-C-U-T-E, to make that possible, to make it feel real. But the real benefit of that was it almost gives Gary like this kind of fuzzy kind of texture. That's really what those snakes look like, but it made him kind of like cuter in some manner. I will say that Yvette is deeply afraid of all snakes.
Me too, Yvette.
Oh, good.
But not Gary the Snake.
Not Gary. He's one of my favorite new characters, but
she only likes one snake now, which is Gary.
That's true.
Progress.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population. Just let me handle the locals. Hey, bub.
Hey, bub.
Hey, bub.
Hey, bub. Hey, bub, bub.
Hey, bub. Bubby, bub.
Hey, bub. Hey, bub. Hey,
Hey, bub, bub. Seen a snake?
Nope.
And Yvette's interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but you did not work in the first film, right? So how was it to move along? Because there was a sense of expectation as well, because the first film has been a big hit. There was the 10-year gap. How was it to actually enter the Zootropolis world?
Yes, it's such a fun world to kind of go into and play with. I am a huge fan of the first film. And the moment I saw it completed, I was like, oh my gosh, I love this film. And so getting the opportunity with working with Jared and Byron again to come into this world and start playing, I was super excited. But, doing a sequel and continuing their story is also a bit intimidating because not only did I love these characters, the world loved these characters, and they all have their own expectations of what they want this story to be and what they want to happen. And so it's a little intimidating, but, if we just kind of focus on the story and making sure that we're making a film that we love and that we want to see in the theaters was always kind of our focus and our goal to kind of let's put all those expectations aside for a second and just focus on what we want the story to be. And we're so thrilled on how the world is receiving it all.
Yvette Marino and Jared Bush, the creative team behind Zootropolis or Zootopia 2, speaking to Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally on today's show, the Winter Olympics have been underway since Friday's opening ceremony in Milan. Monocle is there on the ground throughout the next 2 weeks, broadcasting from the Allianz Winter Sky Lounge with a special show called Monocle in Milan. Well, on today's edition of that show, Monocle's Ed Stalker spoke with Marco Samicelli. He's curator at Milan's Triennale and director of the Museum of Italian Design. And he also spoke with the German industrial designer Konstantin Gurcic. Together they co-curated Whiteout. It's an exhibition at Milan's Triennale dedicated to the future of winter sports, given, of course, the very real threat of climate change and how it impacts winter sports. Ed started by asking Marco about the thinking behind the project.
This was a project that, together with Konstantin Gurcic, we elaborate in order to take advantage of the Olympic atmosphere and show how winter sports have been changing the past 20 years due to the climate change. It's not a show about Olympic amenities like mascots or medals or torches. It's about equipment, infrastructure, safety, and how the landscape is actually reacting to the massive tourism of winter sports. Working together with a maestro like Konstantin has been tremendously important for the Triennale because we joined forces in order to deliver a design show in a design museum. And since we opened like 10 days ago, we received a massive response, not only by the press, but by an incredible amount of people that is visiting the show, also because it's for free. And it was very important that Triennale and the Chamber of Commerce offer this as a cultural entertainment during the Olympics.
And I think also, as well as all the public, you may have had someone who's fairly important, the president, none other, of the Italian Republic, who visited the other day. Tell me about that.
Oh, it was... I was speechless. The moment the Corazzieri, the National Quirinale Guards, entered the building, and then President Mattarella and Madame Laura arrived, and they were absolutely surprised by the genius of Italian design and, at the museum. And then when they saw Whiteout, it was extremely important to us.
How did you two come to work together? How did you come to co-curate this exhibition? He also obviously did the design for the exhibition itself. I know you're a big fan of his work.
Yeah, I mean, Konstantin is a champion of industrial design. He is also a practitioner of winter sports. He likes to ski a lot. But during the Paris Olympic Games, he was invited to the Grand Palais and the Musée de Luxembourg to design an exhibition called Match. I found it very interesting. So I asked him, like, do you want to, repeat, but, do a winter edition? And it was fantastic. Also because while we were preparing the show, we did a sort of like a safari between Lombardy and Veneto in order to discover different companies and meet designers and entrepreneurs that are actually developing a lot of interesting equipment and ski and boots. And over there, with this particular eye, we've been able to collect traces of contemporary design, because Whiteout is basically about that.
I'm told that we have Konstantin on the line. Marco was telling us a little bit about all your travels, researching this exhibition. How did you obviously you wore two hats for this, designing the actual set for the exhibition, if you like, and curating. How did you split those tasks, and how did you divide amongst you and Marco what your areas of focus would be, given that, this covers everything from equipment to fashion. It covers so much.
Well, I think the split between the two of us, Marco and myself, plus my assistant, Natalie, who worked closely with me, I think that the split was very mutual. I think we had very natural discussions about what we both felt was interesting and relevant to include in the show. And obviously, there were many different stories that are interesting, and we had to be selective, because an exhibition takes place in a certain space, and the space is a form of limitation, even though it's a beautiful space in the Triennale. And I don't want to say limitation because it's too small, but it is of a certain size, and that meant to be selective. And so, wearing those two hats, being on the one hand responsible for the research and content, and on the other hand, designing the show, I think it's a big advantage. It makes certain decisions quite fast, very direct and quick. And on the other hand, I feel as the designer of the scenography, I'm so inspired by the theme, by the content, by what we are talking about, that had an influence on the design of the displays. And I think it shows. So certain materials we chose, the logic of how we deal with space, how we deal with form, how we take the visitor around a certain parcours in the show.
We've got about a minute left, Konstantin, so I'm going to ask you a huge question to answer in a minute. How was it dealing with the thorny issue of climate change in this exhibition? The fact that obviously snow is potentially reducing. How did you tackle that issue in Whiteout?
Well, it was essential, really. I mean, it was from the start. It was clear that this is one, big issue we had to tackle. It kind of appears in different places throughout the show, but one particular One is where we speak about infrastructure. That means how do we make a ski resort into a ski resort or winter sport resort? And what does it mean in a projection into the future? We talk about today and a projection until in 55 years in the year 2080. And we have picked out three clear arguments of what will change here. So the winter sports resorts will have to move higher. The demand for water, the requirement for water is increasing by a lot. And the winter sports season will be reduced from something like 100 days now to 24 days in 56 years' time. But like I said, throughout the show, it kind of keeps on coming back, and the final installation of the show, as you leave the show, we have commissioned the artist Scott Cannon to generate an artificial intelligence generated video to show something of a future. What would it be like to practice winter sport in the future? And just one last thing. There's one element in that film, and that is about how do we get to these resorts? And the traffic is one of the big issues. So much bigger than one would think. How do we, the individual traffic into winter sports resorts is one of the big responsible for carbon footprint. And if we can change that into public transport, then that would already make a difference.
Traffic is a massive issue. I can attest to that myself. The German industrial designer Konstantin Gurcic and Marco Samicelli, curator of Milan's Triennale, director of the Museum of Italian Design, speaking to Monocle's Ed Stalker. For more of our coverage from the event, the Olympics, you can tune in to Monocle in Milan every day this week and next live at 9 a.m. London, 10 a.m. Milan time on Monocle Radio. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Monica Lillis. Our researcher was Annalise Maynard and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye and thanks for listening.